Hi there, I'm Jorja McAndrew and this is the Graham Sibbald Podcast. If you're new to the show, each week we talk to a member of the Graham Sibbald team about an area of surveying, and this week is absolutely no different. Today we are discussing Graham Sibbald's new carbon sustainability department, so sit back, relax and enjoy this week's episode of the Graham Sibbald Podcast. Welcome to the latest Graham Sibbald podcast. We are joined today by Tom Meney, who is Head of Carbon and Sustainability at Graham Sibbald, based within the firm's Glasgow office. Good morning, Tom. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, Georgia. Thank you very much.
Glad to hear it. So could you tell us a little bit about your role and what your remit will be?
Yeah, sure. I think at this stage, we all understand the challenges that face us in respect to climate change risk and the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions around the world. But I think put that in the context of the commercial world, Graham Sibbald has also recognised the significant prospects that are materialising as the UK accelerates its plans to deal with those challenges. So Pamela Matheson and I have joined the team at a hugely significant point, in my opinion, in the UK's transition to sustainable low to no carbon economy. And we're tasked with developing Graham Sibbald's carbon and sustainability team and the services it offers in order to capitalise on the opportunities that will present themselves as the UK drives towards its commitment to achieving a net zero position by 2050. And Scotland, by the way, have also committed to achieving the same result, but 5 years earlier. Our clients, current and new, will require support in assessing risk and opportunity, in planning for change, decision-making and implementation. They're going to have to remain compliant and competitive throughout that journey, and they're going to become efficient, sustainable organisations. And our role is to create and deliver a range of solutions, which is going to establish Graham Sibbald as an essential go-to partner in managing environmental change, not least in familiar sectors such as property, transport and infrastructure.
Fabulous. That's super interesting. So what other G&S departments form part of the wider energy services offering?
Yeah, so the carbon and sustainability team benefits from a broad range of skills, resources and experience, which I firmly believe are going to make our solutions robust, comprehensive and very compelling. I'm glad to say we're joined by representatives from the planning department in Kerry Maguire, building surveying through Neil McFarlane and Danny Little, in architectural services through Andrew Daly, and petroleum and roadside from both Callum Campbell and Brogan Greer.
Great. So you mentioned at the start it's a crucial time in climate change in the UK. So how exactly is the government enforcing change?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my 20 years of involvement in the environmental sector and in environmental compliance in particular, my experience has been that unless people and organisations are obligated or incented to change, and I'll call it the carrot and stick approach, if you like, then they generally won't. So governments, businesses and individuals have been reluctant to acknowledge climate change and have been too slow to react, in my opinion, over the last few decades. That all changed right enough with the introduction of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Virtually every nation at that point then signed up to that agreement and made legally binding commitments to reduce their carbon emissions in an attempt to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees within this century. Now, the UK actually led the way internationally, introducing the world's first national emissions targets through the UK and Scottish versions of the Climate Change Act back in 2008. That actually introduced a raft of mechanisms for climate change action, which have originated from it. And as a result, there are now a plethora of national strategies, policies, regulations, financial instruments, and mandatory reporting obligations which now exist. And basically, they will force that change. At the highest level, national plans include decarbonisation of the electricity supply grid, the elimination of dependency on fossil fuels for heating and transport, the delivering of energy efficiency and sustainability in the built environment, carbon capture and storage, and indeed afforestation and restoration of UK peatlands to allow those resources to become carbon sinks to actually absorb carbon dioxide. And to be more specific in our sectors, some of the main drivers from government are going to be the UK net zero strategy, the national infrastructure strategy, the heat and building strategy, Scotland's climate change plan, and the planning and environmental bills. On top of all of those, we also have financial drivers The government offer grants in some cases for environmental change, but also incentives to change, such as carbon pricing for the largest emitters in the UK. The climate change levy, which creates a tax on every kilowatt of gas or electricity consumed by businesses, and other fuel duties and taxation instruments at their disposal. So, those who will not or are slow to respond to change are going to feel it in their pockets as well.
Thank you so much for that roundup on government change. I'm sure the listeners will agree they learned loads. I certainly did. All right, so with that in mind, I guess an obvious question is, where should a business start when looking to reduce their environmental impact?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, it's important to understand that every business in each sector that we deal with tend to interact with and be acted upon by the environment in different ways. So a business needs to firstly understand the context and scope of its own activities in order to correctly identify its environmental impacts, but also then has to quantify those impacts in order to determine which of the aspects of its activities are likely to generate the most significant impacts. So to carry out, for example, a comprehensive carbon assessment, or as we might know it, a carbon footprint, will achieve this and give the business a solid baseline from which it can meaningfully plan its improvements on environmental performance. And in many cases, the emissions from heating and lighting buildings and from the use of transport are typically the most significant aspects that we're going to come across. So plans to address those impacts should be given the highest priority typically.
Okay, so as Graham Sibbald are active in these sectors, can you give us an example of the scale of impacts that transport and buildings have on UK total carbon emissions?
Yeah, to give you some context, firstly, the UK's last published total of greenhouse gas emissions in 2019 was around 450 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's a big number. Transport, in actual fact, is the single largest sectoral contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and it accounts for more than a quarter of all the UK's emissions. Energy production and supply is next. It's around 21%, and business as a sectoral group accounts for a further 17% of all those emissions. So that makes up the majority of the country's emissions. Buildings in their own right actually account for 16% of the direct emissions resulting from the combustion of fossil fuels, and that's typically for heating purposes. They also account for almost 60% of the indirect emissions which result from electricity consumption as well. And that, for example, comes from heating and cooling applications, lighting, infrastructure, power, and IT. So in conclusion, these aspects of human life account for the majority of all our emissions, and they must undergo a rapid and sustained change if the UK is to meet its net zero ambitions.
Well, thanks, Tom. I think that's all we have time for today. It was really great to hear your insights, and obviously it's fantastic to hear Graham and Sibbald are committed to tackling climate change. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, again for your time today. For more information on the new Graham and Sibbald Energy Services team and their offering, please go to www.g-s.co.uk. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to you joining us again next week. This was the Graham and Sibbald Podcast, presented and produced by Jorja McAndrew.